Chapter 5 of Fanny Herself. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 5. There was no hard stock in Brandeis's bazaar now. The packing room was always littered with straw and excelsior dug from hogsheads and great crates. Aloysius lorded it over a small red-headed satellite who disappeared inside barrels and dived head-first into huge boxes, coming up again with a lamp or a doll or a piece of glassware, like a magician. Fanny, perched on an overturned box, used to watch him, fascinated, while he laboriously completed a water set or a tea set. A preliminary dive would bring up the first of half a dozen related pieces, each swathed in tissue paper. A deft twist on the part of the attendant Aloysius would strip the paper wrappings and disclose a ruby-tinted tumbler, perhaps. Another dive and another, until 6 gleaming glasses stood revealed, like chicks without a hen mother. A final dip, much scratching and burrowing, during which armfuls of hay and excelsior were thrown out, and then the red-headed genie of the barrel would emerge, flushed and triumphant, with the water pitcher itself, thus completing the happy family. Aloysius, meanwhile, would regale her with one of those choice bits of gossip he had always about him, like a jewel concealed, and only to be brought out for the appreciative. Mrs. Brandeis disapproved of store gossip, and frowned on Sadie and Pearl whenever she found them, their heads close together, their stifled shrieks testifying to his wit. There were times when Molly Brandeis herself could not resist the spell of his tongue. No one knew where Aloysius got his information. He had news that Winnebago's 2 daily papers never could get, and wouldn't have dared to print if they had. "Did you hear about Myrtle Krieger?" he would begin. "That's marrying the Hempel boy next month? The one in the bank. She's exhibiting her new trousseau at the Outagamie County Fair this week for the Handwork and Embroidery Prize. Ain't it brazen? They say the crowd's so thick around the table that they had to take down the more personal pieces. The first day of the fair the grandstand was, you might say, empty, even when they was pulling off the trottin' races and the balloon ascension. It's funny, ain't it, how them garments that you wouldn't turn for a second look at on the clothesline or in a store window comes kind of wicked and interestin' the minute they get what they call the human note? There it lays, that virgin lingerie, for all the country to look at, with pink ribbons run through everything, and the poor Krieger girl never dreaming she's doing something indelicate. She says yesterday if she wins the prize she's going to put it toward one of those kitchen cabinets." I wish we could stop a while with Aloysius. He is well worth it. Aloysius, who looked a pass between Ichabod Crane and Smike. Aloysius, with his bit of scandal burnished with wit, who after a long, hard Saturday would go home to scrub the floor of the dingy lodgings where he lived with his invalid mother, and who rose in the cold dawn of Sunday mornings to go to early mass, so that he might return to cook the dinner and wait upon the sick woman. Aloysius, whose trousers flapped grotesquely about his bony legs, and whose thin red wrists hung awkwardly from his too short sleeves, had in him that tender, faithful, and courageous stuff of which unsung heroes are made. And he adored his clever, resourceful boss to the point of imitation. You should have seen him trying to sell a sled or a doll's go-kart in her best style. But we cannot stop for Aloysius. He is irrelevant, and irrelevant matter halts the progress of a story. Anyone, from Barry to Harold Bell Wright, will tell you that a story, to be successful, must march. We'll keep step, then, with Molly Brandeis until she drops out of the ranks. There is no detouring with Mrs. Brandeis for a leader. She is the sort that, once her face is set toward her goal, looks neither to the right nor left until she has reached it. When Fanny Brandeis was 14, and Theodore was not quite 16, a tremendous thing happened. Schabelitz, a famous violinist, came to Winnebago to give a concert under the auspices of the Young Men's Sunday Evening Club. The Young Men's Sunday Evening Club of the Congregational Church prided itself, and justifiably, on what the papers called its auspices. It scorned to present to Winnebago the usual Lyceum attractions, Swiss bell ringers, Negro glee clubs, and family fours. Instead, Schumann Heink sang her lieder for them, McCutcheon talked and cartooned for them, Madame Bloomfield Zeisler played. Winnebago was one of those wealthy little Midwestern towns whose people appreciate the best, and set out to acquire it for themselves. To the Easterner, Winnebago and Oshkosh and Kalamazoo and Emporia are names invented to get a laugh from a vaudeville audience. Yet it is the people from Winnebago and Emporia and the like whom you meet in Egypt and the Catalina Islands and at Honolulu and St. Moritz. It is in the Winnebago living room that you are likely to find a prayer rug got in Persia, a bit of gorgeous glaze from China, a scarf from some temple in India, and on it a book, hand-tooled and rare. The Winnebagoans seem to know what is being served and worn, from salad to veilings, surprisingly soon after New York has informed itself on those subjects. The 7:52 Northwestern morning train out of Winnebago was always pretty comfortably crowded with shoppers who were taking a 5-hour run down to Chicago to get a hat and see the new musical show at the Illinois. So Shabulitz's coming was an event, but not an unprecedented one, except to Theodore. Theodore had a ticket for the concert, his mother had seen to that, and he talked of nothing else. He was going with his violin teacher, Emil Bauer. There were strange stories as to why Emil Bauer, with his gift of teaching, should choose to bury himself in this obscure little Wisconsin town. It was known that he had acquaintance with the great and famous of the musical world. The East End set fawned upon him, and his studio suppers were the exclusive social events in Winnebago. Schabelitz was to play in the evening. At 3:30 that afternoon there entered Brandeis's Bazaar a white-faced, wide-eyed boy who was Theodore Brandeis, a plump, voluble, and excited person who was Emil Bauer, and a short, stocky man who looked rather like a foreign-born artisan, plumber or steam-fitter, in his Sunday clothes. This was Levine Schabelitz. Molly Brandeis was selling a wash boiler to a fussy housewife, who, in her anxiety to assure herself of the flawlessness of her purchase, had done everything but climb inside it. It had early been instilled in the minds of Mrs. Brandeis's children that she was never to be approached when busy with a customer. There were times when they rushed into the store bursting with news or plans, but they had learned to control their eagerness. This, though, was no ordinary news that had blanched Theodore's face. At the sight of the three, Mrs. Brandeis quietly turned her boiler purchaser over to Pearl and came forward from the rear of the store. "Oh, Mother!" cried Theodore, an hysterical note in his voice. "Oh, Mother!" And in that moment Molly Brandeis knew. Emil Bauer introduced them floridly. Molly Brandeis held out her hand, and her keen brown eyes looked straight and long into the gifted Russian's pale blue ones. According to all rules, he should have started a dramatic speech, beginning with, "Madam," hand on heart. But Schabelitz the Great had sprung from Schabelitz the peasant boy, and in the process he had managed, somehow, to retain the simplicity which was his charm. Still, there was something queer and foreign in the way he bent over Mrs. Brandeis's hand. We do not bow like that in Winnebago. "Mrs. Brandeis, I am honored to meet you." "And I to meet you," replied the shopkeeper in the black sateen apron. "I have just had the pleasure of hearing your son play," began Schabelitz. "Mr. Bauer called me out of my economics class at school, Mother, and said that—" "Theodore!" Theodore subsided. "He is only a boy," went on Schabelitz, and put one hand on Theodore's shoulder. "A very gifted boy. I hear hundreds. Oh, how I suffer sometimes to hear their devilish scraping. Today, my friend Bauer met me with that old plea. You must hear this pupil play. He has genius. Bah! Genius, I said. And I swore at him a little, for he is my friend, Bauer. But I went with him to his studio. Bauer, that is a remarkable fine place you have there, above that drugstore. A room of exceptional proportions. And those rugs, let me tell you." "Never mind the rugs, Schabelitz. Mrs. Brandeis here." "Oh, yes, yes. Well, dear lady, this boy of yours will be a great violinist if he is willing to work and work and work. He has what you in America call the spark. To make it a flame, he must work, always work. You must send him to Dresden under our—" "Dresden?" echoed Molly Brandeis faintly, and put one hand on the table that held the fancy cups and saucers, and they jingled a little. "A year, perhaps, first in New York with Wolfson." Wolfson? New York? Dresden? It was too much even for Molly Brandeis's well-balanced brain. She was conscious of feeling a little dizzy. At that moment Pearl approached apologetically. "Pardon me, Miss Brandeis, but Mrs. Trost wants to know if you'll send the broiler special this afternoon. She wants it for the washing early tomorrow morning." That served to steady her. "Tell Mrs. Trost I'll send it before 6 tonight." Her eyes rested on Theodore's face, flushed now and glowing. Then she turned and faced Schabelitz squarely. "Perhaps you do not know that this store is our support. I earn a living here for myself and my 2 children. You see what it is, just a novelty and notion store in a country town. I speak of this because it is the important thing. I have known for a long time that Theodore's playing was not the playing of the average boy, musically gifted. So what you tell me does not altogether surprise me. But when you say Dresden, well, From Brandeis's Bazaar in Winnebago, Wisconsin, to our in Dresden, Germany, is a long journey for one afternoon. But of course you must have time to think it over. It must be brought about, somehow. Somehow. Mrs. Brandeis stared straight ahead, and you could almost hear that indomitable will of hers working, crashing over obstacles, plowing through difficulties. Theodore watched her breathless, as though expecting an immediate solution. His mother's eyes met his own intent ones, and at that her mobile mouth quirked in a sudden smile. You look as if you expected pearls to drop out of my mouth, son. And by the way, if you're going to a concert this evening, don't you think it would be a good idea to squander an hour on study this afternoon? You may be a musical prodigy, but geometry's geometry. Oh, Mother, please! I want to talk to Mr. Schabelitz and Mr. Bauer alone. She patted his shoulder, and the last pat ended in a gentle push. Run along. I'll work, Mother. You know perfectly well I'll work. And he looked so startling like his father as he said it that Mrs. Brandeis felt a clutching at her heart. Theodore out of the way, they seemed to find very little to discuss, after all. Schabelitz was so quietly certain, Bauer so triumphantly proud. Said Schabelitz, Wilson, of course, receives $10 a lesson ordinarily. $10? But a pupil like Theodore is in the nature of an investment, Bauer hastened to explain. An advertisement. After hearing him play, and after what Schabelitz here will have to say for him, Wolfson will certainly give Theodore lessons for nothing, or next to nothing. You remember, proudly, I offered to teach him without charge, but you would not have it. Schabelitz smote his friend sharply on the shoulder. The true musician. Oh, Bauer, that you should bury yourself in this. But Bauer stopped him with a gesture. Mrs. Brandeis is a busy woman, and as she says, this thing needs thinking over. After all, said Mrs. Brandeis, there isn't much to think about. I know just where I stand. It's a case of mathematics, that's all. This business of mine is just beginning to pay. From now on I shall be able to save something every year. It might be enough to cover his musical education.